Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Australia Institute webinar. We've just opened the gates, and it will take a little while for our audience to join, so hang tight with us just for a minute or two, and then we'll get started. Thank you for joining us. Again, joining us, we're just letting folks get connected on the technology, and we'll start in just a minute. Thank you very much. Folks are still streaming in electronically here, so just hang tight for another few seconds and then we'll start our webinar today. Thank you again for joining us. We've had a great deal of interest in our session today, and lots of people coming in, and it does take just a minute or two to get everyone on board here. So hang tight. We'll start very shortly. Thank you for joining us. We had over 1,000 registrations for our webinar on sellers inflation. A great deal of interest in this topic, and we're just thrilled to have Dr. Isabella Weber as our guest speaker. And just another minute or so, and we'll get started as people get all connected here. Okay, friends, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Folks are still streaming in, but we'll kick things off, and we'll be very glad to join everyone when they get connected. Welcome to this Australia Institute webinar on the economics and politics of sellers inflation with our very special guest, Dr. Isabella Weber from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst Economics Department. Lots of interest today. My name is Jim Stanford, and I'm the economist and director at the Centre for Future Work, which is a project of the Australia Institute focusing on labor economics and related issues, including, of course, over the last 2 years, a lot of discussion and interventions on inflation, its causes, and its remedies. So that is right up the alley of our topic today. Now, before I get started, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us are joining this session, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining our webinar. And from the Australia Institute's perspective, we do want to express our shared commitment to winning a fairer future in our relationships with Indigenous peoples, including campaigning strongly for a yes vote in the Voice referendum. Personally, I'm joining the webinar today from Vancouver, Canada. We've got a truly global show for you today, and so I want to pay my respects here to the unceded traditional lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people that I'm joining the webinar from. And please take a moment, all of you, to reflect on the lands which you join from. Just a quick couple words on the program and etiquette for our webinar today. We'll start after an introduction of our guest speaker with a conversation between myself and Isabella. Then we'll open it to questions from the audience in the last half of the webinar. To submit a question, please use the Q&A button that you'll see on the bottom left of your screen, and we will curate those questions and try to make sure that the ones we're able to forward to our speaker cover the full range of topics related to the subject today. And please be polite in your questions and collegial. Then we'll finish the session at 11 o'clock sharp Australian time. That will be 9 p.m. The night before in Amherst, Massachusetts, where our guest speaker is joining us from. So it is my tremendous pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Isabella Weber to our webinar on the economics and politics of sellers inflation, a concept which she has done so much to help us understand what's happening, to communicate knowledge of what's happening, and then to explore the policy ramifications of what's happening. Let me say a few words about Isabella's many contributions to economic theory and policy, already remarkable for someone in the early stages of their career. Isabella has not one, but 2 PhDs, one from Cambridge and one from the New School for Social Research in New York, both great heterodox schools. Coincidentally, Isabella, I also have a degree from each of those universities, although only one of mine is a PhD, so I guess I'm an underachiever on that score. Isabella's Cambridge thesis was a very important contribution to research on Chinese economic development strategy and has informed a very important book that Isabella has released since then called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. Very well received, well reviewed, and already translated into multiple languages. Isabella now serves as Associate Professor of Economics at UMass Amherst, another great heterodox program. And there she works with the Political Economy Research Institute, or PERI, which is a think tank kind of like the Australia Institute, frankly, in the American sense, covering a whole range of important economic and social and political economy topics and contributing to progressive policy responses to those. These days, of course, Dr. Weber is best known for her pioneering and courageous work on monetary and inflation policy. Her early interventions in the initial upsurge of inflation after the COVID pandemic included proposals for short-circuiting the initial surges of that inflation through price regulations in various strategic sectors of the economy. And more recently, of course, she's done, with colleagues, careful empirical work on how that initial inflationary stimulus coming from strategic sectors of the economy was propagated and translated into broader inflation and what that implies for how we understand that inflation and how we respond to it with policy. Isabella's work has thrown into question the orthodox diagnosis of inflation as always arising from an overheated labor market and undue wage increases, as well as throwing into question the orthodox remedy to inflation, namely monetary tightening and trying to drive inflation or unemployment back up towards that minimum NAIRU level. Her work in this area has been widely cited internationally in the last year and a half or so, including by policymakers that she's been meeting with in her travels. Isabella, I've seen on your social media feed, you were in Brazil recently meeting with the government there. You were in Berlin advising government policymakers there on how to deal with this, and of course cited by many international institutions. So that's a very impressive contribution. Thank you, Isabella, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Jim. This is extremely generous. And let me just say it's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to be in the future, so to speak, if you are on tomorrow's morning. But the pleasure is really to speak to folks who have been kind of sharing this journey in the inflation debate. So thanks for having me.
Great. And I just know how intense the pressures are on you these days coming from all around the world, given your role in this debate. And we're grateful that you could clear some time to join us in Australia. So Isabella, let's just start. Maybe we could review some of the key elements of your analysis, your model of sellers inflation. Many of our viewers today will have read a bit about your story, your narrative, your analysis, and your policy conclusions, but perhaps we could start by summarizing some of the main points. What is sellers inflation? How does it start? And how does it progress through the economy?
Yeah, so by choosing this language of sellers inflation, we are building on Abba Lerner's work, who basically has been pointing out that there is no essential asymmetry between wages and profits in the price formation, in the sense that price increases and therefore also ultimately inflation could come from either wages or profits. And if it comes from the side of firms actually actively setting prices and thereby playing a central role, then I mean we can talk about sellers inflation in the sense that the sellers are in the driver's seat. But the important question that you raise is really like, how does this start? And I think that this is an important question in the sense that our analysis of sellers inflation is an analysis that focuses on a sequence, a dynamic sequence of different stages. So it's often been interpreted as simply saying like profits go up and therefore inflation goes up or something like this. But it's really trying to define different stages in the inflationary process to try to make sense of why it is the case that after many years of surprising price stability, inflation is suddenly back with us in rich countries. I mean, it's never gone away in many poor countries. So how does it start? We start by saying that there's basically a so-called impulse stage. So you have a situation of stability and then you have an impulse. And this impulse comes out of the systemically important sectors, where we define systemically important sectors as sectors that have a particular bearing on the economy as a whole, and are as such highly connected with the production network. So we are really focusing here on the upstream systemically important sectors. To give you some examples, we would be thinking of things like steel, energy, and so on. So kind of the beginning of the value chain, if you want so. Now, what happened with COVID is that a lot of these sectors, in particular the energy sector, saw demand collapse in a very sudden way. They reduced supply. They reduced supply often in a way where they shut down, or quite systematically in a way where they shut down the most costly kind of facilities. So they were left with the lower cost facilities in the oil industry, for example. Then economic activity picked back up and the prices in these sectors basically exploded. Now, we are not saying that in commodity markets, firms are price setters. Firms, of course, have some degree of ability to decide how much of the shut down facilities they are going to reopen. And if they're in a situation where they're left with lower costs and higher prices and therefore extraordinary profits, I think the earnings calls in some places tell a story where the incentives of reopening higher cost facilities are not necessarily very high. But in any case, the point is that in this impulse stage, you get a price and profit explosion that comes basically from commodity markets as a result of first shutdowns and then the picking up of economic activity again. Then the question is, if you have such a price and profit explosion, which presents itself as a cost explosion for everybody who is using outputs of these sectors, how are the different actors in the economy going to be able to react to this cost explosion? And what we argue is that in sectors that are highly concentrated or that are structured such, more generally speaking, that firms are price makers, these cost shocks have enabled a propagation of these costs onto consumers. Now, the point is that before this impulse, before this shock, in these same sectors, I mean, most of the sectors that we are talking about in rich countries today are fairly highly concentrated and have a relatively small number of large firms that are basically price setters. Nonetheless, before these shocks, before these impulses, these large firms have actually been keeping prices quite stable. I mean, we have had an incredible degree of price stability despite these incredible levels of corporate concentration. what we are arguing is that in quote unquote normal times, or let's say in times without such major shocks, firms don't increase prices unilaterally because they risk losing market share. So even if demand goes up, they tend to not increase prices, but they have tended to react by increasing supply because they were in command of incredibly efficient, incredibly global, incredibly powerful production networks of a type that we have basically never seen before. So if the demand in the car sector went up, then Honda wouldn't say they are going to increase prices because they would risk losing their business to Toyota. And Toyota would also not say we are going to react to this demand increase by increasing prices. Rather, they would increase supply, trying to capture as much as they can from this increase in demand in order to maintain or even increase their market share. Okay, now in a world where you have these mega shocks happening, where everybody in a sector knows that there is a gigantic cost shock, and where the pricing role, by and large, is one that is focused on maintaining profit margins, these enormous cost shocks are a signal and basically a coordinating device that let these firms know that now is the moment to increase prices, where you are not at risk of losing market share to your competitors, because in a moment of this kind of shock, everybody is assumed and is also talking about it on earnings calls and is behaving in a way that signals that they will be increasing prices. Now, for this argument, it's enough to say that they're increasing prices to protect profit margins. So we don't need to see profit margins to go up for this cost shock to be propagated and to be turned from a local cost shock, let's say in the oil and gas industry, to a more or less universal kind of inflation as firms react to this cost increase by increasing prices to protect their margins. Now, one point that is often misunderstood is that if a firm keeps their profit margins constant in response to a cost shock, this actually means, as a simple matter of accounting, that profits go up because you're now having the same margin over a higher volume of cost, and therefore the actual profit volume goes up. It also means that if firms are able to protect their profit margins, but workers are not able to keep their wages up in real terms, that basically the corporate sector manages to pass on the cost of the cost explosion to the wage earners and basically does not absorb any of this cost shock. Now, on top of this, at this second stage, which we call the absorption stage, which we call the propagation and amplification stage, there can also be a form of amplification of these cost shocks in the sense of not just protecting profit margins, but actually increasing profit margins. And there can be factors that are conducive to such an increase in profit margins, such as, for example, when there is a bottleneck, that means that firms in a certain sector are not only confronted with higher costs, but are actually confronted with shortages of critical inputs, which basically renders them as temporary monopolists, because they know that they can only, if you take the example of the car sector again, they know that they can only produce as many cars as they have computer chips. And they know that their competitors can only produce as many cars as they have computer chips. So this whole dynamic that I described before about the quote unquote normal situation, where they would be in command of these incredibly powerful just-in-time production network, now turns into a situation where all of the market players are basically dealing with shortages, which means that they cannot expand their supply in a just-in-time kind of fashion, which also means that increasing prices is much, much, much less dangerous because basically your competitors don't have the capacity to intrude into your territory in the way in which they would in other times, or simply put, the pressures of competition are temporarily kind of easing. Now you only started off me how it's you only asked me how this process starts, and I already kind of gave half of a lecture of how it goes on. So maybe I should stop here and let you jump in, Jim.
Well, I want to hear about the third stage as well, in terms of what happens then when workers and consumers see their real incomes falling because of the propagation of those initial shocks, and then are going to fight to try to protect themselves. So that can set off a more traditional type of inflation that to me sounds kind of like the old conflict models of inflation that would have been described in heterodox theory in the 70s and 80s. Does that seem right?
Absolutely. So basically the idea is that after this first stage where you have this impulse of profit and price explosion in these systemically important sectors, and then the second stage, which is a propagation amplification stage of these impulses, where firms basically protect their position. Then in the third stage, workers eventually react to a decline in living standards, right? And for example, in Europe, we have seen very dramatic declines in real wages. So of course, eventually unions are going to fight back, right? And are going to try to reclaim some of the lost living standard as a result of inflation. Now, if wages then go up, there is a possibility that as a result of sellers' inflation, you get conflict inflation, in the sense that firms might react to this increase in wages by again increasing prices, because wage increases, as John Kenneth Galbraith, as a matter of fact, was already arguing in the 1950s, tend to be sectoral, right? So they tend to be, at least in unionized context, they tend to be sectoral. But even when unions are weak, they still, I mean, there's like a certain wage standard in a sector, right? Which means that you again have like kind of a sector-wide cost shock, if you want so, because wages are now going up, which could again be such a signal to firms that now is a good moment to increase prices. However, whether this happens or not, from my perspective, is not like a mechanical thing where whenever wages go up, prices automatically go up, but it's a matter of a whole tapestry of dynamics. It depends on how much wages actually went up, whether they went up by a little or by a lot. It depends, of course, also on the demand in the sector that firms face. And if you have a situation as we have right now, where basically wages start going up at a moment where interest rates are already high, which in certain sectors is going to be felt earlier than in others, right? Then the space that firms have to increase prices can vary across sectors. But in principle, there's a possibility that the catch-up wage increases serve as a renewed impulse, and that you then get a second round of sellers inflation that kind of grows out of the conflict that manifests itself once workers start fighting back. One thing that I think is pretty important is that at this second stage, when we talk about firms protecting their margins, it's of course the case that not all firms are equally able to protect their margins, right? So we actually see a pretty stark distribution. So there are some firms that are more able than others. But by and large, if we look at the economy as a whole for the US and for the European context, we see that if we do macroeconomic decompositions, that the contribution of profits has tended to be higher in the earlier phases of inflation, which to me suggests that the corporate sector as a whole has been in a strong position to protect their margins rather than to have to pay for inflation.
A couple questions kind of coming out of that. Number one, that third stage, the kind of conflict or catch-up stage, obviously depends institutionally on whether workers have the power to try and win back what was lost in the first stages. Can you comment a bit on how today is different than the 70s and 80s conflict inflation in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So in as I guess already this like rather long-winded, complicated explanation of these different stages suggests, we are really thinking here of a pretty institutionalist kind of understanding of the inflationary process. And of course, the wage setting itself is part of this institutionalist kind of context, which changes over time, and where the power of labor has, of course, changed quite dramatically. The IMF actually, in their analysis of European inflation in a recent study that came out, I think, in May or June, did this interesting comparison of the two oil shocks in the 1970s and the cost shocks in the context of the aftermath of the pandemic. And sorry, when I talked about the impulse stage, I of course forgot to mention that on top of the already exploding prices in the commodity sector, we got the second mega shock of the Russian war on Ukraine that, of course, hugely exacerbated energy price increases. But already in 2021, we had very stark increases in energy price. But of course, this sharp increase then gave way to an explosion. Sorry, just realized that I forgot to mention this obvious point. But to go back to the IMF analysis, so basically they compared the first and second oil shock in the 70s with the energy price shocks in 2021, 2022. And what they find is that, and doing this kind of macro decomposition where you take the GDP deflator and then you look at the contribution or the share that is accounted for by profits and wages. And what they find is that in the 70s, it was actually labor that was better positioned to protect itself against the cost shock, whereas today it's been the corporate sector that has basically managed to pass on the buck to labor, so that we see a larger contribution of profits to inflation. So that, I think, is a macroeconomic perspective on the question of how labor is positioned to fight back. But at the end of the day, there's nothing inherent in a cost shock being paid for by the corporate sector or by labor. But I think at the end of the day, that is also a matter of basically the power balance between labor and capital.
And then again, on that third stage of the process, an honest central banker could actually look at your model and say, yes, I agree that's how the whole problem got started, but I'm now infatuated with the risk that this third stage of workers trying to catch up to real wage declines that were caused by something else will propagate inflation in the future, and I'm going to stop that. That isn't actually how the central banks generally communicate it. They've generally dressed up the whole storyline in excess demand narratives and so on. But an honest one could say, I know workers didn't start this inflation, but I'm not going to let workers continue the inflation by trying to short circuit that potential impact of catch-up wage gains on future prices. How should we respond to that argument?
Yeah, what you say is basically the line that Lagarde, for example, has been taking in her recent speeches, right? Where she, when she characterized the inflation process, has been often using language that I think is extremely close to the language that we have in our Sellers inflation paper. But then they basically say, because now we have these catch-up wage increases, we have to hike interest rates even harder to prevent this kind of second round impulse type of situation. Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognize that what is happening here is a huge process of redistribution, right? So if we have, I mean, in a case of let's say, a European country where you have energy being by and large for most countries an imported good, you have basically a terms of trade shock, right? And then the question is, who is paying for that shock? If you have a domestic oil and gas sector or energy sector, and you have such a cost, then basically, I mean, there's a sector within your economy that is suddenly becoming much richer, but it's still the question of who is going to pay for this sector becoming much richer, right?
You've just described Australia, by the way, so well done, Isabella.
And the US, of course, right?
Yes.
The US is, yeah. So if it is the case that basically the corporate sector by and large could protect its profit margins and even increase its profit volumes, but workers by and large got poorer because real wages collapsed. And when I'm using the word collapsed, I'm not being dramatic here. I mean, in the European context, there are countries where they literally, their real wages literally collapsed, right? And then you step in and you say, you're now gonna hike interest rates even harder, or just keep hiking as fast as you can. Then you are basically trying to undermine this wage catch-up process, right? Because the idea of increasing interest rates to fight inflation is ultimately that you want to create, I mean, you want to cool down the economy, which always like sounds kind of nice. I mean, it's extremely hot in Amherst today, so something is being cooled down, it kind of sounds like a breeze of fresh air. But in reality, it's of course a pretty brutal policy that is basically trying to throw people out of work so that aggregate demand goes down and together with investment, of course. And therefore, you ultimately make workers pay for the inflation or for the cost shock that gave rise to the inflation, which I think is hugely problematic. Now, you could say, well, you don't care. This is just like some sort of a lefty position of someone who somehow likes workers or something. But we are, of course, also in I mean, not so much in the US, because there you had interest rate hikes at the same time as you had the biggest fiscal stimulus initiatives in a pretty long time, right? So a lot of the kind of cooling down was compensated by heating it up through fiscal. But in the European context, where you did not have that level of fiscal intervention, you have a situation where, I mean, I'm now like basically thinking of Germany, where you have a situation where you are already in a recession, right? We are already in a technical recession. The forecast is kind of, I mean, the IMF outlook is pretty sobering, with negative GDP growth in 2023, which of course lands Germany at the end of the list. So some other European countries are faring a bit better, but they still have very low growth, right? So they certainly have growth that is much lower than we would hope for coming out of a pandemic, in a pandemic recession, right? Now, if you basically make everybody poorer at a time where you're still also trying to recover, I mean, at the end of the day, this will, of course, also take out a lot of the dynamism of your economy. Now, you could say, well, I don't even care about this, because I'm seeing the trade-off between employment and growth and inflation, and I prefer to get inflation under control. Then I think one might want to remember that in many countries we have, I don't know what the situation looks like in Australia, but in many countries we see the far right on the rise in a pretty scary kind of way. And we are coming out of a pandemic that, of course, was a pandemic also of inequality, in the sense that certain groups of society were affected by the pandemic much more than the more privileged groups of society. So you kind of come out of this social economic shock in which people, like whole communities, literally were devastated, saw their loved ones die, saw members of their family get long COVID. Then they see their living standards decline, and then on top of it, you basically don't let them catch up back to somewhere closer to the living standards that they once experienced. I think that this is extremely explosive kind of policy from the perspective of social cohesion, where I think a lot of societies have already been like kind of in extremely tense situations.
Oh, you're certainly right. Now, you mentioned the IMF study, and we've actually seen, in a way, a kind of a whole parade of international institutions lately that have published their own research that seems quite consistent with the seller's inflation narrative, at least in terms of describing what's happening, including OECD research, Bank for International Settlements, some of the central banks, even the US Fed Reserve, some of their research papers seem to be acknowledging the role of that initial surge in profits in explaining what happened initially. I'm almost scared to have people like that on my side of the debate. How do you understand the reaction from those institutions, and do you think it indicates a willingness to consider different policy responses, or is it just more of a kind of an empirical investigation of what's been happening?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that these studies seem to be coming out of international organizations or people in central banks who are really trying, to do basically policy design, right? So these are like super highly skilled research economists, but not necessarily in the academy, but more in the kind of applied side of economic analysis. Which I think is interesting. And I think what we saw in terms of the dynamic of the inflation debate is that in the early stages, people looked at inflation simply like kind of from a textbook Econ 101 type of perspective. I mean, most economists in rich countries hadn't thought about inflation in a pretty long time. So they either defaulted back to some like basic ideas, like inflation is always about aggregate demand in relationship to capacity utilization, or some rare creatures who might still have monetarist inclinations might have been looking at the quantity of money perspective, or some older folks or folks who happen to have studied the 1970s would have kind of defaulted back to like kind of the victories narrative on the 1970s as a wage price spiral kind of inflation. So I think that, and also, by the way, of course, we didn't have a lot of data and so on, to begin with. So the first reaction to inflation, I think in many ways was kind of everybody arguing from their theoretical priors, right? Now, a bit more data has been coming out and much more empirical analysis has been done. And it turns out that, we can have long debates about causality, right? It's of course a hugely important yet contested, I think, concept in economics. But it's clear that the macro decompositions are showing a pretty straightforward picture, in the sense that in most country cases, we have seen a larger part of inflation being accounted for by profits rather than by wages. Now, I'm very consciously using here the language of accounted for, even if you say, okay, this is not a causal story. You cannot go from an accounting identity to a causal interpretation. Then nevertheless, accounting exercises can rule out certain stories that are not plausible, right? It might, you can never take a causal mechanism from an accounting exercise, but you can rule out certain stories as less true, or I mean, in fact, as non-consistent with the accounts that you have, right? And I think it became pretty clear that these accounting exercises that the ECB has been doing, that the IMF is doing in their latest analysis, that the OECD, I think, also has in their report, basically more or less rule out the idea that this inflation has been driven from the wage side. So then you kind of have to look further, right? And you have to ask yourself, I mean, what is it that is driving this inflation? And then a lot of the arguments that I have been putting forward, I think, suddenly pretty obvious arguments that occur to anyone who is serious about their empirical work. Now, it's of course one thing to change the analysis, and quite a different thing to change the policy prescription. And I think right now we are in a situation where the analysis has quite dramatically changed in the course of the last 2 years or so. But the policy prescription, of course, has in the European context, to be fair, also has changed, because of course we have seen a wide range of price policies. We have seen a wide range of fiscal policies that were designed as like emergency measures. In the US context, the policy response has also changed in the sense that we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a public investment program, right? I mean, this is a kind of inconceivable, even in 2021, I think it was still like hard to imagine that would actually happen, right? So in that sense, there has been change, but there hasn't been as much change on the part of the central banks. So the central bank policy is pretty much doing whatever it's been doing, which I think has a lot to do also with institutional path dependency. And I mean, if you are at a central bank and your mandate is price stability, and all that you can do is hike interest rates, then what are you going to do if inflation is high? You're going to hike interest rates, right? So it's like in some sense a bit of a if you only have a hammer, everything that you see looks like a nail type of problem. That is, of course, hugely. I'm not defending this. I'm just saying I think this is part of the explanation of how this has been going about.
Yes, that argument of institutional hysteresis is actually very interesting, and I think can shed some light on what's been happening. I want to go to some of the questions that our audience has been submitting. There's a whole list of them, and one of them flows directly from what you just said. Actually, several asked about what are the alternative policy prescriptions for controlling inflation, given this different diagnosis. So Richard Bentley, Mark Leon, and Henri Vickers, among others. What about things like price controls? Maybe too late for this initial surge, but learn from it for the next time, possibly. Enforced savings policies, like trying to shift income into things like pension funds, or in Australia's case, superannuation funds, as a way of reducing demand without cutting wages, if in fact you thought demand was the problem. Or redistributive fiscal measures, excess profits taxes combined perhaps with either price subsidies or some kind of income subsidies for consumers to help offset the impacts of inflation. This suite of alternative measures, Isabella, what are the potential for winning some of those things? In some cases, we have won them. Spain is an example that comes to mind. But how do we further the argument for those alternative policy responses?
Yeah, so I think first of all, we have to acknowledge that inflation is a really difficult problem to have, right? So there is no silver bullet, I think, where you can like just simply do one thing and then it will magically all go away. That being said, I think that the story that I'm telling, or the analysis that I'm presenting on inflation, is basically one that is hugely sectoral and where there's a lot of emphasis on the impulse stage, right? So I'm basically saying there are, and this is in relation to some of the input-output analysis that we have been doing, there are some sectors which have prices that matter much more for overall price stability than other sectors. And I think we are living in an age of overlapping emergencies. So we have been experiencing two mega shocks. We have experienced the pandemic, and we have been experiencing the Russian war in Ukraine. And on top of it, climate change is, of course, a reality. And in fact, as the UN Secretary General was pointing out, we are already in the age of global boiling, right? So all of this is to say that I think more shocks are likely to come. Maybe it won't be like things on the scale like a global pandemic or a major war in Europe, but maybe it will
Maybe
be.
it will be. Yeah.
Maybe it will be. Even if it's not on the same scale, or even if it's on a larger scale or smaller scale, what we have is that these shocks tend to have very heterogeneous effects on different sectors. So we have shocks that are hugely sectoral. And we have a situation where some of these sectors, when they get completely unhinged, we get huge systemic outcomes that are very undesirable, such as inflation. Now, what I'm arguing is that we need a form of economic disaster preparedness for these systemically important sectors to be able to respond to such shocks by trying to absorb them as locally as possible. What do I mean by that? I mean by that you need sector-specific policies that enable you to react to a sudden supply shortfall or a sudden explosion in demand, sectoral, not aggregate, in which then, I mean, by implication also resides in a supply shortfall in relation to demand, of course, that allows you to react to this in ways so that you don't get price and profit explosions that then like kind of create all these collateral damages. Now you can say, oh, this is super abstract and very unconcrete and unhelpful. And I agree, it's pretty abstract and pretty general. But the point of me not saying the way in which we should react to absorb such shocks is ABC, is because I happen to be of the opinion that such shock absorbers need to be designed to specifically target the structures and institutional arrangements that you have in a given sector. So let me give you an example. If we look at housing, we would probably be doing something very different from what we might be doing for oil and gas. For oil and gas, it happens to be the case that in the US, they actually already had a shock absorber, right? They have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which has been mobilized, which has contributed to bringing prices down. It's not large enough to bring prices down internationally. It's been mobilized pretty reluctantly in the beginning and then very forcefully and so on. But a buffer stock is a form of a local shock absorber that can basically build a bridge between a sudden extreme mismatch between supply and demand in one specific sector. Another example is ports. I mean, we have all learned that ports are an incredibly important piece of infrastructure and can literally become the bottlenecks of an economy that is as import dependent as, for example, the United States. If you let the freight rates explode, and while the Port of LA and other ports in the US were basically experiencing gigantic traffic jams, if the freight rates go up by 200, 300, 400, 500%, this doesn't make the traffic jam go away, right? The traffic jam is there. So what you would have needed is a better disaster preparedness, quite literal, like a better protocol, a pressure relief valve to deal with this kind of situation in terms of management of the port, to be able to get out of this traffic jam quicker. Now, if you are in a situation like this port situation that I just sketched, and you get price explosions that do not induce a supply response because you have a physical blockage of the port that is not going away from freight rates exploding, which, by the way, can also be the case if you have a price explosion in oil and gas, and you are at the same time, for important political reasons, imposing a sanction regime, and are basically saying that you can no longer import oil and gas from these and these places, then you have also created a supply barrier that is such that the supply adjustment will not simply be forthcoming in the way in which it would be in a normal market setup if the price explodes. So in these kind of situations, temporary limits to price increases, I think, can be a measure that can buy time for measures that then actually correct the supply shortfall. So the idea is not that the price control or the price policy, or whatever you want to call it, or even a price gouging law, right, which is not even a direct price cap, but a prohibition of price gouging in situations of emergencies. These basically prevent the prices from exploding, but they are not going to fix the underlying issue that you have that made the price explode in the first instance, right? As Galbraith, one of the most important scholars of price policy, has been pointing out, price controls can always only buy time, right? But if you are in a situation of an extreme emergency, of an extreme shock, buying time can be extraordinarily consequential. So strategic, targeted, temporary price policy to buy time for measures that help you absorb the shock that you are dealing with can be a policy that I think can be part of the disaster preparedness kit. But of course, it's preferable if you are able to have shock absorbers that can be mobilized so quickly that you don't even get a price explosion, because you can signal to the market that supply is going to adjust very quickly because you have this other thing that you can mobilize. Then of course this is preferable. But the point is that they can, in extreme situations of emergencies, buy time. Now you can say, okay, this is all nice for future shocks and so on, but now we are in the midst of it, and it is already, I mean, the mess is there, and it's ugly and so on. I think that that basically, by and large, we need a toolbox approach to fighting inflation. So what I have been just saying is basically focusing on the impulse stage. And I think the more you can do on the impulse stage, the better, because the more you can like have this thing not even like go through the whole economy, the better. But at the propagation amplification stage, I mean, things like windfall profit taxes that create very, I mean, that of course need to be well designed, that need to be sectorially specific and so on, can be a useful tool. Things that policies that rely on agreements between unions and business associations can work in corporatist setups. So for example, in Germany, there has been a so-called concerted action to fight inflation, but all that happened was a commitment for labor unions to not demand higher wage increases, where I think you would have needed not just like a one-sided, ultimately anti-labor policy, but you would have needed a commitment from both sides, from both the corporate sector and the labor sector, to absorb this shock rather than to pass it on, right? And create this I mean, all these spiraling effects. Policies that stabilize people's basic living standards, such as free public transport, and thereby like taking some of the pressure out of the situation, I think can also be helpful. But all of this is like basically a toolbox approach. Once the cat is out of the cage, then you kind of have to, I mean, think hard about measures that you can use to basically create pressures on firms to absorb some of the cost shock, to stall things at that point. But if you are in the third stage and you actually have had all these price increases and all these profit increases and so on, then I think you still have to focus on the corporate sector, because you basically have to make sure that the wage increases that are necessary to only re-establish the distributional situation that you had before the inflation, where already before the inflation we have been talking about an inequality crisis. I mean, inequality became one of the most favorite topics in even mainstream discourse, which I think is a sign that it really is an incredibly urgent problem in most societies in rich countries. So what we are talking about is re-establishing the distributional situation at a time when we were already concerned about an inequality crisis, right? So therefore, we need the wage catch-up. The question is, how can we create pressure on the corporate sector to absorb some of this wage catch-up, rather than to use this as a new impulse. And the ability of different parts of the corporate sector to do that is, of course, very unequally distributed. And maybe one last point on this. So you could now say, like, yeah, this all sounds like very state interventionist and very lefty and so on. But I think one thing that also happens in this inflation process, as I've hinted at before, is that you get an incredible inequality also in the profitability distribution, right? So in some sense, you also get a very messy situation in terms of the distribution of profits, which, I mean, on my mind, profitability is one of the most important coordinating mechanisms of a capitalist economy. If your profitability becomes very erratic, with total record profits in some areas of the economy, and not such great outcomes in other parts of the economy.
You're describing Australia again, Isabella. Well done.
Then and all of this is happening not because of the genius of entrepreneurs, or because of technological innovation, or even like managerial innovation, but it's happening simply because the ways in which people could or could not take advantage, or had not to pay for the mega shock, determines these outcomes. Then I think, like, one of your most important coordinating mechanisms in a capitalist economy suddenly becomes pretty unreliable. And it will be interesting to see what follows from that.
Well, both Christine Lagarde and Joe Biden said profits had to come down in order to allow real wages to recover without setting off a further cycle of the inflation. So they've been reading your articles as well, obviously. Let me try and squeeze in two more questions, one sentence answers to each. One questioner asks, what about food and grocery industries? They're not really one of those upstream strategic sectors that you mentioned, but they have been an important source of the cost of living crisis. Do you understand them in the same way as those other sectors?
Yeah, so when I talk about the impulse stage, I'm thinking about one share of the systemically important sectors, which is that share of the systemically important sectors that has a great bearing on production. Not because I think production is necessarily more important than consumption, but because shocks in these areas that are central to the production network then touch upon the price decisions of firms in all these related sectors. But if we just think about systemically important sectors in relation to inflation defined as the CPI, then of course food is absolutely important. And in fact, one of the sectors that we find again and again as in our input-output analysis as being one of the systemically important sectors.
Right. Okay, one last question. What about competition policy? If the size and concentration of firms in an industry allows them to propagate those cost shocks more fully, is there a role long-term, I guess, for competition policy in terms of limiting concentration and breaking up oligopolies?
Yeah, so I mean, the strange situation that we find is, as I've tried to argue, that in these like incredibly concentrated sectors, we also had enormous degrees of price stability for quite some time, right? So it's not like there's necessarily no competition per se in these sectors, but competition, I think, in these highly concentrated sectors works more like a strategic kind of warfare rather than your perfect competition of infinite numbers of firms being price takers, right?
Certainly.
They are basically engaging in strategic interactions over territory, which is basically the market, right? So while on the one hand, the concentration, I think, is an enabling factor for this kind of strategic pricing behavior that I have described, at the same time, it is, I think, pretty challenging to get at this kind of dynamic simply through competition policy. I'm all for competition policy. I think it's in many sectors we have to think very seriously about competition policy. But I think it's difficult to get at this simply through competition policy because, I mean, you're not going to change the corporate concentration in the short run, right? I mean, when you have these shocks, when you have inflationary processes, I mean, you have very short run kind of dynamics, and you're talking about a long run structure, right? Another problem in getting at this through competition policy is that if it is indeed the case that these price hikes have not been coordinated by explicit cartels or explicit price agreements, but kind of by implicit agreements that are a result of the coordination that resides from these shocks themselves, then I think it's much more difficult to kind of get at this. But it's an interesting question. I think it's basically an open question that we need to think more about. Like, is there, I'm not a competition lawyer, I'm not an expert on competition policy, but are there ways to get at this kind of pricing behavior through competition policies?
That's a very nuanced and thoughtful answer. Thank you. Isabella, I'm sorry that we have reached the end of our hour, and I don't want to keep you any longer because I know how intense the demands on your time and attention are amidst this very important intellectual and political debate that we're engaged in. So I also want to apologize to those who've submitted questions. We've got a whole lot of them, 40 in the queue, but obviously we couldn't get to them. I've tried to synthesize some of them, but thank you all for your questions, your input, and your attention in the audience. We will post a recording of this webinar on the Australia Institute channel within the next couple of days. And Isabella, our profound thanks to you for joining us and also for your incredible scholarship, but also your incredible courage in carrying on this debate. And we're very much fighting the same battle in Australia, and we're really glad to share this hour with you. Thank you again, and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a true pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks everyone for the webinar. We'll see you next time. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.